Well, I came there with a freshly minted PhD from the University of Minnesota, but I wasn't freshly minted because I had worked about 10 years prior to getting my degree. So I had already published 7 or 8 papers, and when I got to the university, I had some credibility, which enabled me to do several things. One, to get an appointment as an associate prof immediately, even though I hadn't worked in a university beyond Minnesota. And the University of Washington was an interesting place because everybody looked so different from me. I was the only black professor there when I got there. And I was happy to be there because I knew the faculty in the School of Social Work wanted me to be there. They very avidly recruited me. I was being recruited by about 5 institutions at the time, but I chose Washington because of the feeling I got about what kind of place it was or could be. I wasn't naive to the degree that I thought it was perfect, but I had a feeling that these were good people. Now, saying all of that, when I got there, I found out it wasn't quite as good as I expected. As I said, I was the only professor there, black professor there at the time. There were very few black students, and the atmosphere was kind of a hands-off. I didn't find hostility, just disinterest and a lack of overt recognition that it's not a good place if a university doesn't have diversity. At that time, black students tended to be more in the social sciences, and that was one of my concerns, that they didn't feel welcome in other than the social sciences initially. Now, I was in the graduate school of social work, but the reason I got a joint appointment, in my view, was because, A, I had been trained in sociology, but at the same time, they just needed someone to teach the students who were coming in who made them feel welcome on campus. I think the BSU had really its inception at a meeting in San Francisco or somewhere in California, and Larry Gossett and a few other students were the leadership people on that level, which is a regional activity, which was a regional activity. And then they came back with some clear ideas about where the University of Washington ought to be in terms of what it could do. And from that, the Black Student Union became a reality. I became the advisor to the group, and then subsequently, the students really gave impetus to the notion that we ought to have a Black Studies department on campus. So I wrote the protocols for that, and I had an interesting kind of interactive position because I was on the faculty senate as an elected faculty member, and later when I became provost, vice provost, I was there on the basis of that position, so I gave up the first one. But the point is, when you're on the Senate, you get a chance to influence people around intellectual ideas. So what we did was focus on the academic content. We didn't want a program that simply said Black Studies with no substance. So we did write a protocol, and we went through a process that was rather rigorous and contentious because you can't always do it right the first time. And the students wanted something that was right out of the box and ready to go the first time. And we had some difficulty, but it did come to fruition, and as best I know, it's still operating. In my view, the campus reflected, it was a microcosm of the society in a larger sense, but more importantly, it was a reflection of Seattle. People lived in districts, if you will. And if you said Bothell, if you said West End, whatever, everybody knew something about you simply because of the historical way people behaved in those areas. It didn't mean that they were negative about people who lived in different places than they, but it meant that if you lived in the central area of the city, which is where most blacks lived, the central area in the South End, they had very little interaction with people from other parts of the city. As a consequence, when they got on campus, they never saw anybody from their area of the city. They never felt welcome to the degree that they wanted to feel welcome. So that's a part of the context. So the question isn't, in my mind, were there problems? The question was, how do you sort of frame those problems and look for answers to resolve them? So we went about trying to do something a little different. We tried to get people to understand that we all have to be educated to our own best self-interest, and if you exclude people, you can never have anything other than the least common denominator. You cannot grow a vital society based upon notions of we and they, and we and they have to survive using the same resources. So this is where we began, and we tried to educate everybody, not just the students on campus, but faculty, the community. I guess I spent half of my time outside of the university working with community groups or speaking at churches and synagogues and other places to get folk involved in the process. First of all, there were not, again, I have to say this, there were not pockets of hostility anywhere in the community. I'm talking of hostility in the sense that people can act on it and have it institutionalized. Yeah, there were people who would rather have things remain as they were, and that's partly human nature. Nobody likes change, really. We like to be comfortable, and we're comfortable where? We're comfortable with things we know and can relate to without anybody having to give us more instruction. So what I found were people interested in doing things for the campus as long as they could feel a part of it. So I found that there were a lot of changes, just the institutionalization of what happened in terms of Black studies, in terms of the various departments shifting their focus from where they were to become more inclusive. A lot of things, and some of it happened informally, some in a formal sense. Faculty began to make contributions to Black studies. And also the leadership was very good when I got there, and it improved when people saw the need. For example, Odegaard was a very liberal man when you compare him to his contemporaries around the country at that time. And he understood that there had to be one America, and we're better to do it than on a college campus. At a university, people ought to have access to information that can make them better people. And so that was, in my mind, one of the most important factors in getting things done. You had other people there who were the same way. I belonged to some faculty groups that had nothing to do with the official university structure. And we had meetings off campus, in our homes, in the evening, on weekends, and we talked about these type issues, and people were raising questions like, what can we do? And I would say things like, I don't know, because nobody has an answer. You have to go through a process where everybody takes ownership of that process, and the outcome is something that creates a sense that it is a we and not a we and they. I'm glad that each generation has to solve similar problems. Growth is incremental, and that may be the way we sustain whatever growth we attain. That is, we don't have to worry about it being something that you have to reinvent the wheel, as it were. But you take what your fathers and mothers did, and you stand on their shoulders, and you don't forget that it was their power that lifted you up. And the same thing is true in a broader societal sense, where the generations make a contribution, and you may take 3 steps forward and 1 step back, but I see a good deal of progress. I spend a lot of time in Mississippi. I remember when I was afraid to go into the state of Mississippi, and now I travel, and my wife goes with me. We have friends there, Black, white, Asian, and others. Because wherever I go, I'm still a teacher. And what I do is talk about possibilities and those impediments to the achievement of positive outcome. But I could illustrate this for you in so many ways. The company I work for is owned by an Italian family. When we first got there, by the way, they had about 1,800 employees. Only about 4% were African American in Mississippi. Now, they were getting and still get most of their funding from the federal government. I didn't rant and rave about the fact that they only had that small number of black employees. What I did was point out, if somebody points out to the feds that your numbers are so low and you get 85% of your funding from the feds for the programs you offer, I wonder what would happen. And we worked that out, but it took 5, 6, 7 years to get to the point where they now have at least 20% black employees, maybe 2 or 3% in management. I'm on their corporate board. Now, that didn't happen because I was a violent, aggressive person. It happened because we were able to help people arrive at a logical position where it affected their outcomes, not mine. And that's what we have to do. When we look at it in terms of we and they, it's always we are right and they are wrong. But if we look at it as we and they in a process together, we can make a difference. There is always the stick and carrot approach. It depends on circumstances. Without the sit-in, for example, it would have taken the university longer to be more responsive, but it only took 4 hours because you had good leadership at the top. If you don't have good leadership, you have to use a variety of tactics. And sometimes it's in your face, but here's the problem with anything that is not based on logic and reason. You may ask for something you don't want, don't need, and get it. Now, where are you? You are at a point where you are going to be viewed as not too bright, kind of ignorant, and not sure of what you're doing. So it's always a good idea to know precisely what you want, or at least have a clean idea about where you want to go. And always be able to say, I don't have the answer in terms of the process of attaining what I want, but I know what I have isn't what I want, and I don't want to be caught in this trap. So let's work together to achieve some outcomes. The community in large measure supported Odegaard's response. Some people call it his caving in to the demands of the students, but most people in the community were saying, we need to make sure that the university survives and keeps good reputation. You can't look at the immediacy of a situation. You've got to project into the future and see that what you do today is a determinant in what happens to you tomorrow. And the university is a good place. It always has been a good place. It just was not an inclusive place. It didn't have the desire, the need from its perception to reach out to people who were different than the whites in that community. It was not, by the way, a major international and national university at that time. It was parochial in much of its approach, and now it is truly an international, national, major institution of its kind. I was advisor to the BSU, and I knew it was going to happen. Yes, I was there. I think there was tension, of course, and there were no security guards initially. The president's doors were locked before and after the students got in. We were in the anteroom, and when the security came, they saw that there was no damage done. You get a lot of information, some of which is not correct, about the number of people there. All of the people didn't go into the room where the president was. There was an outer office, and maybe 20 or so students were in that outer office, and maybe 10 in the inner office. So there was not chaos. It was a logical, orderly approach to the 5 or 6 demands. I think about 5 demands they presented. And all of them were acceded to after about 3-4 hours of discussion about which was most important, what all of them meant, and how should the university proceed, and what were the students asking the university to do. And that's when the president appointed some people to look at each of those issues in terms of implementation of a process to make them happen. You know, people view presidents as having inordinate power. I want it done, says the student, and the president says, maybe a good idea, but I have to talk about this with, and then he names a lot of people. They don't want to hear that because they're in a mood for immediate outcome. And I think part of that went on with that meeting with President Odegaard, where he was saying, well, you know, the faculty has to look at this, the Senate has to look at this, and the students were saying, you make it happen. You know, they weren't concerned about the process at that level. And they didn't believe, initially they didn't believe what he was saying, and that's understandable. You know, you don't get anything really done if there's no trust. And you don't get trust unless you've had experience together that solidifies your belief in the other. I mean, if you and I are having a discussion and I know that you're a trustworthy person based on prior history together, it's easier to deal with this current discussion no matter what the content. But they had no prior reason to believe Odegaard or anybody else in that room, you know, initially. I already had positive experiences with President Odegaard. And I knew if he said A, he meant A. And his history before he got there, coming from Michigan, University of, and having had exposure to what I call the Eastern ethic, he had a different view of minorities than a lot of people who had spent most of their lives in different places that didn't provide that kind of view. So he was a different person, a good person, a solid person, and I felt comfortable with what he said. And my role, as I saw it, was to later help implement what came out of the meeting, not to contribute to what the students thought they wanted and what they ultimately wanted. You know. The University of Michigan had far more black students and other ethnic minority students than the University of Washington probably has even to this day. And if you look at it cumulatively, over a period of time, the University of Washington still wouldn't have the numbers that he had been exposed to. He would have had to have dealt with faculty who represented various racial ethnic groups, you know, from the standpoint of what they wanted on those campuses. And the Eastern campus was where the black population was. There was not a substantive black population in Washington State at that time. So what I'm saying, he had a background, though, that let him transcend where he was and bring experience to the discussion that maybe another president could not have done. I didn't advise them what to do. I always discussed consequences and had them focus as best I could on the outcomes they wanted. And if you want an outcome that is an A, you better do Y and Z, because if you don't, you can't get that outcome. And then they have to make their own decision. This is what teaching is all about. You don't impose your will on anybody. You help them understand the consequences of certain behaviors. I didn't even see them as demands. I saw them as statements that would enhance the university's ability to become a true institution that was reflective of the society's needs. They made requests, and I think they became demands in a societal sense because they were different than anything the university had been accustomed to being asked. Yeah, I don't think anybody expected to get a regent immediately, but fortunately, very soon thereafter, some of us were influential in getting a regent appointed. And he was a local dentist who had graduated from the University of Washington, and he stayed on the Board of Regents for a number of years. So if they hadn't brought it to the attention of the institution, maybe it would have been much later that the first African-American regent was appointed. Now, at the same time, the University of Minnesota had a black female, who became president of the Regents, where here we are in Washington State struggling with the notion of should or should not we have one. I mean, you have to look at things in the context. But Minnesota was a different place. Different place. It was truly an international university before the University of Washington, in my view. There was no academic content already formulated that could lead to a series of courses that one could say, these courses constitute Black Studies. You had to do the homework beforehand. And when I said I wrote the protocol, what I'm talking about is we did the research. We looked at the institutions around the country. We didn't have time to do a lot of visiting in different places because there were the requirements that the students were trying to impose on the institution to get it done yesterday. So we got on the telephone, we sent faxes, we did all sorts of things to get the data. And then we put together a syllabus for the program. It was imperfect, but over time we were able to work it out, but not just me. We had faculty now from different departments. But again, most of it came out of sociology, a limited amount from anthropology, social work, and other of the social and behavioral sciences on campus. This was a national phenomenon that didn't have academic validity early on, and this is what people were concerned about. Should it be institutionalized as a department, as a program? What ought the context be? So we had to work through that. But now, in general, there are very few questions raised about the validity and the academic content, but that's after 35, 40 years of working through the issues. It's always a question of emphasis, isn't it? Where if you're talking about American history qua American history, it ought to be accurate and reflect the contributions of everyone, and it ought to have an interpretation of what those contributions mean. At the same time, if you're talking about, let's say, Black Studies, it ought to be able to show the historical influence on and by Blacks in the society with a more intense focus on that, where you're giving it more time, you're doing more explaining, you're raising more questions, you're looking at the cultural context, and that way you have really then the basis for Black Studies as opposed to a component of American history, which is very limited in that sense. Many academics are accustomed to a single way of presentation and a single way of approaching their content. And as I said, people don't like change. And if you're trying to say to them, look, here's what we want to do with Black Studies, they're going to raise a lot of questions, some of which are very legitimate. What's the content? How does it differ from what we're already doing, and so on and so forth. But what I'm suggesting is that there was very little hostility in an overt sense, at the University of Washington. Faculty raised questions, but they raised legitimate questions. And when President Odegaard appointed a man from another part of the university, from the scientific part of the university, we can say, it changed a lot of views because it's a question of the level of credibility you bring to the process, and he brought a lot of credibility. Also, I think when we looked at other institutions, as I indicated, I went out to consult with a number of institutions on the development of their programs. This was, a year later, but there was still a lot of hostility to the notion of Black Studies because they hadn't gotten the kind of credibility amongst their faculty members that we had at the University of Washington. You have to have discussion with people throughout the institution so they can take ownership. It's their program. It's their institutional responsibility to ensure that the quality is there. And that's what they were concerned about. And some people, of course, use those ideas and those notions to try to beat back the idea of putting a Black Studies program on campus. They didn't see it as having any merit or any academic rigor. And the real question always revolved around the notion of academic rigor. And once you got past that, you didn't have too much difficulty. As a matter of fact, one of my real concerns was that people were trying to make Black Studies so rigorous that it was more difficult to get a degree there than in some other parts of the university. My concerns are broader than institutions like University of Washington and other places. It has to do with what's going to happen to our country, and how do we prepare young people to have views or express views that are different from what's out there right now and not be penalized for it. And one of the ways I think you do that is opening up the fora and letting people express notions that are not popular. And you've got to do that if you're going to be helping the nation have the kind of future that I expect we all want, which I hope is a peaceful nation that creates an attitude in the world that we as Americans are really good people. And the fact that democracy is imperfect doesn't mean we're not willing to continue to work on it. And if we don't create that, then there will always be wars and rumors of wars in a biblical and actual sense.